Good afternoon. It's not on, is it? Rachel, is it on? Is there one? On the side. Good afternoon, yes, it's on. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome back to the discussion for the International Day of the African Child, Terrorism and Youth of Africa, a threat to international peace and security. If I may start by quoting His Excellency Gary Quinlan, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Australia to the United Nations, speaking on the 13th of May at the United Nations Security Council on the challenges of fighting against terrorism in Africa. I quote, "Particular efforts need to go towards engaging youth, which account for more than 60% of Africa's unemployment. Youth unemployment can be a decisive vulnerability. The average age of terrorists is getting younger." And if I may quote His Excellency Farouk Gazambi, President of Togo, speaking at the United Nations Security Council on the 13th of May 2013 on peace and security in Africa. I quote, "If we don't give African governments the means to carry out an effective and sustainable counter-terrorism strategy, there is every reason to fear the creation of that terrorist arc from Mauritania to Nigeria and beyond to the Horn of Africa." It now gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and the next speaker, Dr. Serena Deutsch, who is a highly trained, licensed clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience. Dr. Serena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ugorji, and I am really honored to be speaking here today and to be speaking amongst some wonderful participants. One of the things that Ugorji had asked me to talk about and to address is terrorism, the impact on children, and also the psychological impact on a child soldier. According to research, there are over 300,000 children under the age of 18 who are child soldiers in Africa. Many of these children are as young, and I think Ugorji had said they are getting younger. Many of these children are 7 years old, 7, 8, 9. The average age is maybe 12, maybe 15, but they are getting younger. In order to understand the psychological impact on children and what it's like to be a child soldier in terrorism, which is highly disturbing, and the impact, the psychological impact in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, anxiety disorders is quite high. I'll get into that as I proceed, but I think it's also important to understand that this will affect, and I think I was talking to one of our guest speakers earlier, this will affect generations to come. If child soldiers have been affected psychologically in terms of what they've been through, what they've experienced, the initiation, what they are expected to do, then we could think about their parenting and their loss of childhood, or they were robbed of their childhood. And if they're ostracized, which most of them are, and not initiated back into their community. A lot of them are orphans. So let me get on with my talk. I know we're limited in time. In order to understand this, let me just highlight a few points that were made this morning, but I'll go into a little more detail. Child soldiers are subjected to horrific treatment. After the initiation, and after they are maybe told that they'll have education and a job and opportunities and their life they won't live a life of poverty, which they're coming from, many of them. They are subjected to horrific situations. It includes severe sexual abuse. A lot of the girls are indoctrinated and initiated and become, at 9 and 10, wives of some of the soldiers and experience sexual abuse. They experience forced abuse. And they're forced to commit and witness horrific atrocities, killings, murders. And these unspeakable atrocities have an impact on them. This is their childhood. This is what they're exposed to. Children, according to the Convention on Children's Rights, are supposed to be protected and educated, and they're supposed to feel safe. And these children have been deprived of these rights. Recruited children are subjected to initiation rituals. And this, not in all countries, but in some countries, includes killing members of their families. And I think killing members of their families or their communities further severs their ties to their community. Once they do this, the community no longer wants them back. And after the 14-year war in Liberia, the community, they were ostracized. They were rejected. They weren't accepted back in their communities. The parents may not have been alive. They may have killed their parents. They may have killed family members or parts of their community. So they are ostracized. They're rejected, and they're also stigmatized. Girls are both used in combat and non-combat roles. And as I said earlier, they're victims of sexual slavery and rape and other forms of sexual violence. Okay, so these are just a bit of the few things that they experience as child soldiers. What's the impact on them psychologically? Most, if not all, child soldiers have been found to develop severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This can be debilitating. Again, though, it depends on the extent of the abuse and the extent of what they've experienced. However, they found that whether they were 8 years old or 12 years old, the impact, if the intensity and severity of their experience as child soldiers was the same, regardless of the age, they did experience extreme forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The DSM-4 classifies PTSD as it's an anxiety disorder. And individuals who experience or witness at least one major traumatic event that threatens death or serious injury or intense fear, either as witnesses or victims, often experience PTSD. That's according to the DSM-4. People after 9/11 experienced extreme forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The PTSD is not written for child soldiers. The experience that these children had were not just one experience or two experiences, but it was on a continual basis, and it could have lasted, let's say in Liberia, the war lasted 14 years. And as I said earlier, if children attempted to escape, they had no family to go back to, and their communities, they were already rejected, and they were already stigmatized, and they were already ostracized. So they were not welcomed back to the community. And a lot of times what happened was they re-recruited themselves, and the warlords were seen as like a father, and the other soldiers were seen as siblings. So this was their family. Overall, the degree and intensity of the traumatic experiences contributes to the degree and intensity of the post-traumatic stress disorder. Former child soldiers are highly vulnerable to a more severe case of PTSD because they are exposed to a greater degree of intense, horrific, traumatic experiences. Equally, both as victims and witnesses, whether they witnessed something or they were victims, they experienced similar forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Child soldiers with PTSD have recurring and intrusive thoughts. So they could be doing something, and all of a sudden they start thinking of what they went through or what happened to them. They have difficulty falling asleep. They have difficulty staying asleep. They have nightmares. They also grew up in at a formative time. This is their age of innocence, and they grew up around aggression and violence. So if a child grows up against aggression and violence, and they're young and they're malleable, and which is also an attraction to recruitment, that they're malleable, that you can tell them what they need to do, or to go to the front lines, or to lay mines, or to to be a suicide bomber. And a lot of times children are malleable and vulnerable, and although they're not strong fighters, there's an endless supply of children. So there's more children that get killed in a terrorist war than adults, because the children are used in high-risk situations. Children also are so young that children by definition, teens or 12-year-olds, or take more risks. We see is now, children will drink and take drugs and do things that put them at risk, and they may not look at the consequences. So these child soldiers they're told to do something and they do it. In addition to PTSD, there are a multitude of other severe psychological disorders in former child soldiers. PTSD is highly extensive, but a significant number of child soldiers also struggle, and I think it was mentioned earlier by our panelists, they struggle with, they were given drugs, and a lot of times drugs and alcohol or, different forms of drugs help them do things that, that they might think shouldn't be doing, or they might think it's not right, but somehow they're given drugs and alcohol, and this continues after they're no longer child soldiers. Drugs and alcohol, as when they're former soldiers and they're no longer soldiers, distances them from the experiences that they live with daily, and that's part of PTSD. They experience it, they feel that they have memories that will come back, and that's part of, again, PTSD. But they also experience much higher rates of depression, and in a number of studies that I'm also a research scientist up at Columbia, we found that that about 37% of the children who were former child soldiers attempted or committed suicide. So it's the feeling of aggression and violence. They don't know how to deal with the ups and downs of life, or just daily life, by, with means other than something that may be aggressive or violent, which also makes it hard for them if we have programs for them in schools. If they're in schools and they're having fights and their behavioral problems, it may not be easy for them to keep them in school. And the other issue, in addition to the post-traumatic stress disorder and the depression and the suicide and the other anxieties, disorders, and sometimes psychotic behavior, is there are a lot of cognitive issues, attentional issues, concentration, difficulty concentrating. If you have constant intrusive thoughts about, this traumatic experience that you had for your entire childhood, or most of your childhood, it will come back. And so here you're trying to learn how to read and write and do math, and these thoughts continue to come back. So a lot of times they attempt school, they go to school, and they don't remain in school. Schools ask them to leave, or they leave on their own. Given that child soldiers spend most of their critical developmental lives in a world that was dominated by violence and aggression, a lot of them have a pro-war ideology. This dominates their worldview. I think at this point, what I'd like to really talk about, because it was discussed a little bit earlier, but thinking about, and I know when I was in Liberia and I spoke to President's Relief about this after interviewing about 60 former child soldiers, a lot of times after going through what they've gone through, trust becomes an issue. Connecting, trusting others. So in a sense, when you try to reintegrate them into the community, or the community that they won't accept them, and you try to find avenues for them, either educationally in terms of jobs, a lot of times they have a hard time being amenable to the programs that are out there, maybe some of the religious programs that really focus on dealing with child soldiers and the impact that the war has had on them and being terrorists has had on them, is an approach. But we have to come up with ideas and approaches that will reach them, because my great concern, and I think something that Ugorji and I have spoken about, is that the child soldiers that become parents, and a lot of times their children were born to a soldier during the war when they were child soldiers. But their way of dealing with the war is by detaching, distancing themselves from others. Communication, I think I spoke to you about that earlier. Communicating and talking to people and relating and connecting is very difficult. So just imagine if you have a family and children, and either conflict is dealt with in an aggressive way, in a violent way, and then, you know, the mother who is supposed to, you know, we expect to hold the child and make the child feel safe, feels very distant. Well, then how would their children, okay, so this is the next generation of child soldiers, how are their children going to respond if they're not getting the kind of parenting that children need in order to feel, in order to protect their soul and their heart and their minds. I think that you said that a number of times this morning, and I was very touched by that. But, you know, how are we supposed to protect them? And the Convention for the Rights of Children, you know, they deserve that. But if they don't grow up in an environment where they feel that safety and that protection and that love, how are they going to be affected? And then these children become children. So it is critical that we develop programs. It's difficult that we figure out how to develop programs to reach these children and to help them, because it becomes generational. It is across generations. If we do not approach this and address this, African children are our future. And if we're talking about peace and security in the world, we need to start here. So, so I implore you, we have to really think about solutions, a resolution to this, and come up with programs. I'm in the middle of developing some and working in Liberia on this, but I think we all need to work together in coming up with some good solutions to help these children. Thank you so much.